Assange legal myth number 1. Julian Assange has had due process in the UK. Ergo, there is no possibility of arbitrary detention.
In 1825, Newgate jailers escorted John Smith along this ever-narrowing corridor. He had been convicted at the Old Bailey of housebreaking. He had no barrister to represent him, no witnesses to call an oath. All he could do was to protest his innocence, in vain. John Smith finished his walk about here, and this was probably his last view of daylight. He was hanged for this crime. John Smith was a boy of just 15. The case of John Smith sounds like an awful aberration, a shockingly disproportionate punishment for a property offence and inflicted on one so young. Yet this was no miscarriage of justice. The trial followed the due process of the day, a due process that was far from equal, but was stacked against the defendant.
What is proportionate punishment? The proportionality principle is now well established in our law. As Lord Sumption said in Bank Mellat v Her Majesty's Treasury 2013 at paragraph 20, the question depends upon an exacting analysis of the factual case advanced in defence of the measure, in order to determine 1. Whether its objective is sufficiently important to justify the limitations of a fundamental right, 2. Whether it is rationally connected to that objective, 3. Whether a less intrusive measure could have been used, and 4. Whether, having regard to these matters and the severity of the consequences, a fair balance has been struck between the rights of the individual and the interests of the community. Thus, then, a disproportionate response, or a response that leads to a disproportionate outcome, can always be seen to be either arbitrary to the purpose, in the degree to which it goes beyond that which is necessary in measure, arbitrariness in the procedure, and by extension arbitrary to the purpose, almost always certainly then leads to disproportionality in treatment. Born of this arbitrariness is the excuse given by many a wrongdoer's claim that they were only following orders. Lastly, on the issue of proportionality, it is a natural corollary that any measure of action that is set in place with an indefinite expiration date will also be disproportionate by the elapsing of time. Any procedures that lack a suitable judicial review of such actions or events that might lead to detention necessarily lead to uncertainty and a lack of predictability. Thus, such actions, events and procedures cannot be said to be in accordance with law, as the demands of Article 8 place upon institutions. These conclusions have not simply been left to be drawn by legal professionals. It has been explicitly stated in legal precedent. It is generally understood since Golder v UK 1975 that a purposive approach to legislation must be taken. That is, we look to what ends, results or outcomes the legislation seeks to achieve. In Amour v France 1996, it is recognised that indeterminacy of or undue lengths of time necessarily can result in arbitrary deprivation of liberty. What is arbitrariness? We have met this notion twice now in the legal context of the principle of proportionality. It has been explained that it is concerned with the seeming choice by persons to irrationally mete out a measure of punishment that goes beyond that which is needed. However, to take this point beyond this abstract explanation and make it concrete, we shall now contrast it with commonly mistaken notions of arbitrariness. First, I pose some questions. How many senses of the word arbitrary are there? Are there different connotations to how it is used contextually? Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard, in his lectures on political philosophy, the module entitled Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, he states that there are points of view to the notions of arbitrariness. Specifically, he speaks of arbitrariness from a moral point of view. How many points of view are there to arbitrariness?
The question was about God's necessity versus God's supposed randomness. You wanted to know if God is a necessary being, and if we agree on that, then how does it follow that God is random? And you use the word arbitrary and random interchangeably, by the way, and they're a little bit different. The word arbitrary is usually more applicable within the realm of conscious choices and decision-making, whereas randomness is more about probability of occurrence and whether conscious decision-making is even a factor. It's a fuzzy line, but...
Locke is against arbitrary government. He's against the arbitrary taking. The distribution of income and wealth and opportunities should not be based on factors for which people can claim no credit. It shouldn't be based on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view.
Hello. What are you three up to today?
Today is a very important day in the life of Lilliputians. It is Carnival Day, the day they choose the new government.
Oh. Do I have a vote?
Oh, no one votes here. All those people out there are competing for high positions.
The one who walks the longest on the tightrope will be the Minister of...
Foreign Affairs. The best juggler will be the treasurer, and so on.
That's ridiculous. But tell me what this war is all about.
Oh, I don't know. Something about eggs.
Eggs?
Yes.
What's wrong?
War is imminent. Our intelligence tells us that Blefusco is preparing their finest ships and vessels for a major offensive.
Come on, Dressel. What's all this talk about war? I mean, you appear such a peaceful little nation. Why would anyone want to destroy you?
The two great empires of Lilliput and Blefusco have been at war for many moons. The reason for this conflict, in a word, is eggs.
Eggs? Yes, I did hear something about it.
It's always been the accepted practice of both empires to open their eggs from the larger end. But some moons ago, a member of the royal court cut his finger by using this method. After this accident, the emperor published an edict commanding all his subjects in future to break the smaller end. 11,000 men are known to have died in the last uprising, but they'd rather die than crack the smaller end of the egg. Thousands of these militants fled to Blefusco, and with the help of some Lilliputian traitors, they managed to form a vast army and navy.
What an amazing story.
In 1825, Newgate jailers escorted John Smith along this ever-narrowing corridor. He had been convicted at the Old Bailey of housebreaking. He had no barrister to represent him, no witnesses to call an oath. All he could do was to protest his innocence, in vain. John Smith finished his walk about here, and this was probably his last view of daylight. He was hanged for this crime. John Smith was a boy of just 15. The case of John Smith sounds like an awful aberration, a shockingly disproportionate punishment for a property offence and inflicted on one so young. Yet this was no miscarriage of justice. The trial followed the due process of the day, a due process that was far from equal, but was stacked against the defendant.
There you go, love.
Oh, lovely. Thanks very much.
Oh, you can't have ketchup.
What do you mean?
You can't.
I'm sorry, excuse me, you can't use the basket?
What's that?
But these girls just ran through, so I don't understand.
Some people can come in, some people can't.
Is he joking? I know.
You have to find an alternative route.
No, I don't want to. If he's going up, I want to go up.
He's allowed to go up.
Why?
None of us like to be told we can't do something. It's the same for the elections in your area in May. If you're not registered, you can't vote. Register online by the 18th of April.
So I claim there are 4 kinds of arbitrariness. Arbitrariness in the random sense, arbitrariness in the moral sense or point of view, arbitrary in the sense of not rationally connected to the purpose, and arbitrariness in the sense of restriction or disproportionate restriction of liberty. This 4th sense is the legal sense. This 4th sense is the primary concern of human rights. Mock the ignorance of the Times editorial piece, which claims Julian Assange is no victim of arbitrary detention. It explains to us what arbitrary detention means. They say arbitrary detention means that due legal process has not been observed. It has. Now let us have a good old hearty old belly laugh at the ignorance and naivety of this so-called legal commentary from The Guardian.